Okay, class. So today we're going to be really getting down to the heart of learning about ancient Greece. This particular presentation is going to be kind of a broad overview, and later on we'll get into a little bit more specifics, maybe some interesting stories, things like that from this particular time period, because it is very interesting, and it's also been, as we've been talking about in the last weeks, or will be talking about in the upcoming weeks, it's been very influential in our society for Western civilization, particularly, but also some in Eastern civilization as well, such as the Middle East and India, etc. And even you could even look at certain aspects of ancient Greek culture, at least under Alexander the Great, that even could be arguably have managed to make it over into China, Japan, etc. So let's continue. At the beginning of the year, you should have gotten a worksheet that outlined this acronym of Persia. I thought, hey, what better way to talk a little bit about it again when we start to talk about ancient Greece and also ancient Persia as well, which we'll be discussing briefly in these series of Greek presentations. Remember, these are ways that we can look at history. And so it's a really good tool in order to kind of gauge like how different contexts and perspectives by which we can look at the past. So we have our political, our military, economic, religious, social, intellectual arts, and then geographic area, okay, or geography. As you could tell, some of this is going to overlap. Okay, for example, if you're in areas where it's a theocracy, the political and the religious are going to overlap. Economic often overlaps in political areas. Okay, economic can sometimes go into the arts, and then economic activities are often very dependent on area or geography. And all of this is going to impact how people's society functions, how people see themselves in the world, and based on that, how they treat each other and how they treat themselves. Okay? So we can see how this all interconnects oftentimes. So here is the Greek peninsula, right here. Okay? And really, we could make this a really wider circle. It could actually come all the way out here as well, and even southern tip of Italy. This is the Greek world. This is the Greek world that the Greeks come into from the Archaic period, where they cease to be hunters and gatherers, and they start to actually master farming and domestication of animals. And so we see them start, some of these are coming from the peninsula's mainland Greece, but down here around Crete, and these areas, we also see the earliest remnants of Greek civilization. Remember, there are always people in these areas, okay? The difference between when does Greece become Greece, it's when the civilization of ancient Greece that we can actually identify as something ancient Greek-like really starts to come into fruition, and we see signs of that society. So the next lessons are going to cover several areas of Greek history. Okay, we'll spend longer periods of time on one than another. Okay, when we look at Greek history, we can look all the way back to the Neolithic, right around the time of the Agricultural Revolution, 6,000 to 3,000 BCE. Early Bronze Age, 3,000 to 2,000 BCE. Middle and late, from 2,000 to 1,000 BCE. Following this, the Greek Dark Ages, the Archaic Age, the Classical Age, which is what we tend to most associate with ancient Greece with, and then finally the Hellenistic Age, under which Alexander the Great ruled, and his generals who came after him. And this is the pinnacle of Greek culture, spreading to the far corners of the known world. And so we'll spend a lot of time on these last two periods. But first, we're going to talk about how Greece starts to become Greece. From the Neolithic period around 6,000 BCE, we start to see people settled into small communities on the Greek peninsula. Farming is introduced, but we have no idea what language they spoke. It was probably some form of Proto-Indo-European language that ended up evolving into the Greek language. In the early Bronze Age, we have a new people that are coming in. they used bronze to create tools and weapons, and this bronze spread from all the way from Egypt to this area. To our knowledge, at this particular time, we do not have any writing. As far as the new people coming in, that particular aspect is not my area of expertise. There were always new peoples coming in, and it's something that's on my to-do list as far as research to kind of figure out a little bit more about these new people coming in. I do not believe it's the Dorians, which was another later people, which the Spartans descended from, but there were multiple peoples coming in and coming not only to Greece, but also to Egypt, the Sea peoples, etc. In the Middle Bronze Age, around the 2000, the first real Greek people arrived that we see evidence of. The architecture looks different. It starts to take a more Greek look. New pottery starts to take a more Greek look, and horses are actually introduced, which makes it a little bit easier for farming and also for getting around on the area. By the late bronze changes, Bronze Age, we have huge changes. We don't have any new people necessarily coming in, but we do have the acceleration of a Middle Bronze technology. So technology is continuing to get a little bit better. We have some of the first Greek civilizations that we're seeing here. Okay, Mycenae, which was a large city with fortified walls. This meant, obviously that war is existing during this period, because you're not going to have to build walls around your city unless you're actually worried about people coming in. We also have evidence of the destruction of Troy by invaders around 1200 BCE, which is more than likely potentially the Trojan War that's written about by the poet Homer. Okay, we have an aggressive, warlike people. We see a lot of war during this time, evidence that shows us that there was a lot of infighting, which, as we go through Greek history, it doesn't necessarily seem like that's changing much. And we have clay tablets that do show evidence of language. It's the Linear A language. We may have already talked about it in class. This is the language that we have not been able to decode. We actually have no way to know what Linear A Greek is. We don't know how to read it, okay? So here's a look at late Bronze Age Mycenae, which was a prominent Greek civilization in the early ancient Greek world. We can still see the remnants of some of the buildings that they had. Kind of a bigger overview of what it may have looked like. By the Dark Ages, from 1100 to 800, this Bronze Age system collapses. And we're going to talk a little bit about this more in later presentations to get a little more in depth. This is just an overview to show you what time periods we're looking at in order to get in your head that ancient Greece isn't like this mindset of classical Greece that has become our archetypal ancient Greek image, that it does change. There are changes here that are going on in the same way that there are changes in fashion or language or music from the 1980s to the early 2000s. I mean, there are clear changes going on in this culture that are occurring, political and otherwise. So we have the entire Bronze Age system collapse. The early Trojan, Mycenaean, and Minoan civilizations, they're gone by the Dark Ages. We do have the coming of what are known as the Sea People. They're occurring all over the Eastern Mediterranean. The Egyptians write about them. There are several theories about who they are. We're not going to get too much into them, but because of that, we do have the entire Bronze Age system collapse, not just in Greece, but in Egypt and areas around the Eastern Mediterranean. There's actually a really good crash course video on that. If you haven't watched it yet, I will direct you to it. All these old Bronze Age sites are essentially, for the most part, abandoned. We see a lot of many different theories. Aside from the Sea People and possible war, we also see climate change as an issue, economics as a potential issue, and more than likely, when something like this happens, it's not usually one issue. It's a combination of all of these issues to create essentially the perfect storm, okay? Over 3/4 of the population is lost. Following this, we have the arrival of people who are known as the Dorians. They arrive around 1100 and they settle in the area around Sparta, and so they become the ancestors of the Spartans. There is no writing during this period. Architecture takes a hit. Pottery takes a hit. They become extremely simplified again. It's like they completely forgot some of the grand things that they were doing within Mycenae and areas like that, and they have to kind of basically relearn it. And so this is a really big setback for civilization in these areas. Coming out of the Dark Ages, we have what is known as the Archaic. It's given the name Archaic simply because it comes before the Classical period. This is a very exciting period in Greece, and we start to get back this idea, we're starting to get into this image of what ancient Greece looks like. During this time, we have the founding of the Olympics, okay? We have a Greek alphabet, all right, that we can actually read introduced, okay? We have the first teamings of democracy right at the end of this period. And then we have the first works of Western literature from Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which tell the story of the Trojan War and what happens after it. This is going all the way back to the Bronze Age, the Bronze Age period, 2 ages ago in Greek history, okay? But we actually have tellings of what is going on in these particular areas. And we'll talk a little bit about its influence on archaeology and history in Greek society. The Greek alphabet, we start to see it used to write the Greek language around the 9th century BCE. We see it's a modification of the Phoenician alphabet, and it also gives rise to the Latin alphabet. So some of these letters are going to be familiar to you, even though it's not exactly the same. And as you can see, we can see how it evolves. Okay, so you can compare, contrast, and how it evolves into something different that we would recognize today. Okay. Classical period. This is the most famous period of ancient Greece, probably. It's during this period that we have the Persian Wars and the 300 Spartans fighting off the Persians at the Pass of Thermopylae. Remember, Rome is founded during this point. If we haven't talked about it already, we tend to teach Rome separately. Okay, as kind of this, oh, it comes after Greece, so Rome can't come until Greece falls. Well, that's not exactly true. Rome as a city is founded in 476 at the peak of the classical Greek period. They traded with Greeks. They knew Greece, and all the Greeks knew where Rome was, or they at least knew of an area over there, because there were actually Greek colonies that were sent by Greek city-states in southern Italy and Sicily, and Rome absorbed from these Greeks that were coming there and settling down there, and so Rome, this is part of why Rome has such a Greek feel in a way, because they interacted with the Greeks and admired the Greeks, okay? It's also during this time where we have the Persian Empire at its peak, at being 3 to 4 times the size of the entire peninsula of Greece, okay? And then we end the classical period with the rise of Alexander the Great, and we enter into the Hellenistic period. Hellenistic period, all right, is it during Alexander? Is it after Alexander? You could say it's both, but essentially it's where the Macedonian Empire breaks into Hellenistic kingdoms. The Greeks essentially are the ruling class of almost everywhere within the known world, aside from maybe China and areas of India. But areas of the Middle East, Egypt, the area around Greek and the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean, this area is all controlled by Greek rulers. Okay, during this time we still have Rome rising to power, and the Hellenistic age ends when Egypt gets absorbed by the Roman Republic, which is expanding out. Okay, and so some of the most famous periods of Rome, like the battles against Carthage, which we'll talk about later, is happening technically during the Hellenistic period, okay, or right after it, and so. Not really. I mean, so we see a lot of things going on at the same time. So don't get into this linear mentality that first there's Greece, then there's Rome. Rome is already on the rise here. Rome is already becoming a powerful republic, and we're going to be talking about that. So just kind of keep in mind that when we finally get to Rome, that the Hellenistic age is also going on, and we can be looking at what's going on here and maybe kind of lend credence to, okay, what is the world that Rome sees, or what is the world that these Greek generals or Greek rulers see? They see Rome on the rise. Rome sees Greece as something to admire and eventually rise to prominence in the same way. So we can kind of see that influence there. So when we start looking at the resources and geography of Greece, is we're going to really see that it really helps to shape Greek society and how they develop. Okay, Greece is very arid. For the most part, in some areas it's semi-tropical. There is limited arable land. This is really only suitable for grains, grapevines, and olive trees. Flocks of sheep and goats graze the slopes, so they're using domestication. But the waterways are going to be a really big deal. Sea is going to be this great connector, allowing vast trade. And so sharply indented coastlines, natural harbors, and small islands within sight of one another made the sea the fastest and least costly mode of travel. Lacking metals and timber, Aegean peoples had to import these commodities. And so earlier civilizations, such as Minoan and Mycenaean societies, they're closely tied to their relations with the other peoples in the region. And so wars are typically fought over three things: food, timber, and mining, gold and silver. Okay. Here's some remnants of Greek weapons and tools from Istanbul. So let's talk about the beginning of archaeology here, because it's a really good place to kind of talk about. Um, we first see the Minoan civilization, which is the early one. We'll talk a little bit about that on the island of Crete. It's discovered by Sir Arthur Evans. Michael Ventris deciphered Linear B, so we learned how to decipher one of the Greek writings. Linear A was of the Minoan here. Linear B was found in Mycenae. Okay, so we have Linear B excavated, okay, but Heinrich Schliemann excavated both Mycenae and Troy, and his is a very famous tale. It's a tale that shows us that even though we can't necessarily take everything in ancient writings as fact, there is some grains of truth to them. All right, so we'll get back to him in just a minute. We're going to talk about the early people of the Aegean. Crete is really the cradle of an early civilization that later influenced the Greeks. It's not necessarily Greek in its of itself, kind of not. Okay, Minoan civilization flourished on Crete. You have the legendary Minos, who's a legendary king of Crete. Probably many of you have heard of the Minotaur. This is coming out of Minoan civilization. Okay, their success was based on trade. They're this big island right in the middle of the Mediterranean, close to the Aegean. They set outposts throughout the Aegean world, and they acquired a lot of ideas and technology from Egypt and Mesopotamia. We have definite evidence that they were in trade and communication with these civilizations. We still can find the palace at Knossos. There were rooms for royal families, religious shrines, banquet halls, and working areas for artisans. The Minoan civilization appears on the island of Crete by about 2000 BCE. It featured a centralized government, monumental building, bronze metallurgy, writing, and record keeping. Archaeologists name the civilization after the Greek legends about King Minos, so we don't know if they necessarily called themselves Minoans, but this is what we call them. We know that this area was home to many ships and skilled craftsmen. The ethnicity of the Minoans is uncertain, but remember their writing has not been deciphered, so this doesn't really give us a lot of answers to this, okay? We know that there was widespread trading connections between Egyptian, Syrian, and Mesopotamian influences. But there is an absence of identifiable representations of Cretan rulers, and this contrasts sharply with the grandiose depictions of kings in the Middle East and suggests a different conception of authority. So we don't necessarily know if, how exactly their concept of rule was, but we do know they had royal families of some sort. Also noteworthy here is the absence of fortifications. We talked a little bit about seeing fortified cities under the Mycenaeans, but we don't really see that with the Minoans, so it tells us that maybe war wasn't as big of a deal there. We also, within the palacites, we see presence of high-quality indoor plumbing. We see statuettes of women with elaborate headdresses and serpents coiling around their limbs, maybe representing fertility goddesses. We have colorful frescoes, which were paintings done on moist plaster surfaces on palace walls, portraying groups of women in frilly, layered skirts engaged in conversation or watching rituals or entertainment, as well as young acrobats vaulting over the horns of an onrushing bull, either for sport or as a religious activity. And we think this is maybe where the Minotaur legend comes from. We see servants carrying jars and fishermen throwing nets and hooks from their boats. It suggests a joyful attitude toward work, but it may also say more about elite taste than about the reality of daily toil. Stylized vase paintings depicting plants with swaying leaves and playful octopuses with undulating and circling tentacles reflect this delight in nature's beauty. All of the Cretan palaces except Knossos, along with the houses of the elite and peasants in the countryside, were deliberately destroyed around 1450 BCE. Because Mycenaean Greeks took over at Knossos, most historians regard them as the likely culprits. But we do have some other aspects that may have led to the decline of the Minoan civilization, such as a volcanic eruption or even an earthquake followed by tidal waves. But the Mycenaeans on the main Greek mainland did invade. They weren't Indo-European people. They were sea traders. They learned the art of writing. It's from them that we get the linear B. And they lived in separate city-states. So we're seeing some of these aspects of Greek lifestyle that we typically associate come into this. We also see these thick-walled fortresses and this concept of a warrior king. Most historians believe that these speakers migrated to the Greek peninsula around 2000 BCE, although some argue for later dates. Through intermarriage, blending of languages, and melding of cultural practices, the indigenous population and the newcomers created the first Greek culture. For centuries, this society remained simple and static. Farmers and shepherds lived in Stone Age conditions, wringing a bare living from the land. Sometime around 1600 BCE, life changed relatively suddenly. Kind of see the Palace of Knossos here. All right, Heinrich Schliemann. Okay, he was not a scholar. He was around the 1870s, and he is famous for discovering Mycenae and Troy. And he was a brilliant, wealthy businessman, and he grew up, with his parents reading to him the stories of Mycenae and Troy and the Trojan War, and he was just determined to prove that it exists. Up until this point, most scholars had assumed that, hey, this was just a legend. He actually utilized the geography described in Homer's Trojan War to actually find the actual city of Troy, and to prove that some event similar to the Trojan War must have occurred. And as well as the Mycenaean civilization. He discovered Troy first, and then afterwards went to Mycenaean Greeks, and he was infamous for smuggling treasures out of Turkey to Germany, and so he stole a lot. And because of this, the field of archaeology actually has a lot of ethical concerns, and even countries started to pass laws on what could be taken. This wasn't just for grave robbers or people stealing things. This was about preserving culture and learning as much as we could about the history of that culture. And so when he went to Mycenae, the Greeks supervised the excavation just to make sure that the treasure wasn't stolen. So here he is here. So the reality of Troy that we've learned since the finding of it is that it had somewhere of a population between 10,000 and 20,000. It was heavily fortified. We see that it was probably a center of trade or textile manufacturing, and it was a place of interest to superpowers. We see that there was Hittite influence. We see that there was Greek influence. The Trojans were more than likely not Greeks, but were Hittites or at least Greek vassals of the Hittite state. And so the Trojans tended to charge a tariff to pass through that area because they were kind of the entryway into the Middle East through the Hellespont, which we'll talk about. It's a narrow water bridge that connects Turkey to Europe. And the Trojan War was more than likely an economic conflict rather than this love story that Homer writes about in the Iliad. And we also see evidence that this was not that whether or not the Trojan War actually occurred, Troy was sacked multiple times throughout its history, and so it was a popular place to wage war. So Troy we know is a real place, but the story of the war is a mixture of myth and legend. Okay, the war was fought between the Greeks and the people of Troy. Within the Iliad itself, written by Homer, gods and goddesses help heroes on both sides of the battle. The Greeks under Sparta and Mycenae won by hiding the Trojan horse and making a surprise attack when the Trojan horse was let into the city. The poet Homer, he wrote 2 poems about this war. The first is the Iliad and the second is the Odyssey. Some additional info. After tricking the Trojans to open their main doors using the Trojan horse, the Achaeans destroyed and mercilessly slaughtered the Trojans. The Achaeans are just another word for one of the Greek groups that were supposedly at the Trojan War, which supposedly it lasted 10 years. This is the earliest picture that we have of the Trojan horse from 670 BC, so we know that this story was told numerous times before Homer even wrote it down. And there's even a debate, okay, was Homer an actual person? Was he a collection of multiple poets who wrote some of this down? And then there's a final version. You know, we're not really sure. It's very, very doubtful that Homer was probably one person, or at least if he was one person, he didn't write this by himself. This was something that was coming to him from other potentially earlier written sources that are now lost, or oral sources being passed down by word of mouth. But he is considered the first author of Western civilization. He passed down stories through songs, oral dictated texts. The Iliad and the Odyssey are his 2 most famous works, really the only works that we have of him, and both poems were published around 725 BC. When we start looking at the Greek gods, the Greeks were polytheistic, but they were also henotheistic, meaning that they believed in many gods, but among those gods, there's one supreme god that kind of rules over the gods. This god was Zeus. He's the most powerful god, and he's the son of the Titan Kronos and the grandson of Uranus. He married to his sister Hera. These gods, such as Zeus, not just him but others, they're depicted very human, with human-like qualities. They look like humans. They tend to have human flaws, such as a hyperactive sex drive. Zeus was pretty immoral. Typically, he didn't really care. He just kind of did what was best for him at the time, a lot of times, and things like that. So, the Greeks believed that their gods and goddesses lived on the top of Mount Olympus, which is located here in northern Greece. And so much of daily life was focused on keeping their many gods and goddesses happy. Today, what we know as myths, Greek mythology, will function as the religion for the ancient Greeks. There were rituals and sacrifices to ensure the favor of the gods, and there was the belief that these gods and goddesses controlled all aspects of life, including the founding of cities, the healing of sick, and the winning of battles. We talked a little bit about the Olympics. The Olympics were found later on during the Archaic period, and they were held every 4 years to honor Zeus, the king of all gods, in the city of Olympia. During this time, there was an Olympic truce. Olympia was located right here, by the way. And all battles or wars were halted so that everyone could come and watch the games. So it was a very religious festival that all Greeks could participate in. This is the death mask of Agamemnon, who was supposedly the Messenian king who went to Troy and fought against the Trojans. And so this should give you kind of a brief overview of some Greek aspects of Greek culture from the earliest period, and kind of a broad overview of the general timeline of what we're looking at within Greek history. Okay, on to the next one.